Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: President Trump's new tariff plan sending shockwaves around the world. From China to Canada and Europe, world leaders are giving mixed reactions.
Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country, and you see it happening already.
Shock on Wall Street. Global stock markets plunged following news of sweeping tariffs. A blow for retailers like Shein and Temu. A new executive order from President Trump closing a loophole that allowed Chinese e-commerce to blossom. And the U.S. reportedly banning diplomats in China from dating Chinese citizens. More on how Beijing could use romantic relationships to extract intelligence. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we dive into today's news, make sure to use the link down below to subscribe to our newsletter. Each week, we round up the highlights and controversies happening around China and the world, and share an exclusive behind-the-scenes snapshot with our readers. Keep an eye out. The newsletter will land in your inbox Friday morning. Beijing is reacting to Trump's sweeping tariff plans to reshape global trade. Now, altogether, China is estimated to face 65% to 70% tariffs on its exports to the U.S. A Chinese Commerce Ministry spokesperson said Thursday that Beijing is willing to communicate with the U.S. on important issues like the economy and trade, adding that China hopes to resolve various issues through consultation. President Trump put sweeping tariffs in place for almost all U.S. trading partners, with the hope of bringing uneven trade to an end.
Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country, and you see it happening already. And if you want your tariff rate to be zero, then you build your product right here in America.
Here's the tariff breakdown. The new policy imposes a 10% baseline tariff for all U.S. trade partners, plus higher customized rates for those the U.S. considers the worst offenders of unfair trade. The new levy for China is 34%. Combining that with existing levies from earlier this year, plus duties from Trump's first term, means China could face tariffs of 65% to 70%. Out of all U.S. trade partners, Washington's largest trade deficit is with China. The White House says the U.S.-China trade deficit has fueled the loss of over 3 million American jobs from 2001 to 2018. Zooming out, the total U.S. trade deficit last year reached over $1 trillion. The White House says the trade deficit has hollowed out America's manufacturing base and forced the U.S. to rely on foreign adversaries for defense and medical goods.
A single shipyard in China now produces more ships every year than all of the American shipyards combined. Think of that. And it was a business that we used to dominate. We used to dominate it totally. In short, chronic trade deficits are no longer merely an economic problem. They're a national emergency that threatens our security and our very way of life.
How are countries and regions outside China faring with Washington's new tariffs? Trump's tariff list sets a 20% tariff for the European Union, 24% for Japan, and 32% for Taiwan. Taking a closer look at the White House chart, Trump said the U.S. is still charging countries less in tariffs than what they charge the U.S.
You think of European Union, very friendly. They rip us off. It's so sad to see. It's so pathetic. 39%. We're going to charge them 20%, so we're charging them essentially half.
Worth noting, there are some exceptions. The administration offered exemptions for pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, energy, and minerals that are not available in the U.S. The White House said tariffs would go up if trading partners retaliate, but would drop if countries take steps to fix their unfair trade practices. Over to the economy. Wall Street continued its decline Thursday in early trading after President Trump announced new tariffs. Global markets also fell. The double-digit tariff hikes have rippled through world markets. Here's a closer look.
Futures for the S&P 500 slumped nearly 4% in afternoon trading today. The Dow Jones Industrial Average futures lost roughly 3%, tumbling more than 1,000 points. Nasdaq futures fell nearly 5%. Oil prices also fell more than 4%, and the U.S. dollar hit its lowest level against the Japanese yen since early October. Trump commented on the market turmoil on Truth Social, writing, quote, "The operation is over. The patient lived and is healing. In a reference to the U.S. economy, Trump said the patient will emerge stronger, bigger, and better than ever before.
In light of the new duties, how are Canada and Mexico faring, given their recent tensions with Washington? Both countries are unaffected by the new tariffs, but they are already grappling with 25% duties on large swaths of their exports not covered by a free trade agreement called the USMCA. Canada's prime minister said his country would impose 25% tariffs on American car imports not covered by USMCA.
Today I'm announcing that the Government of Canada will be responding by matching the U.S. approach, with 25% tariffs on all vehicles imported from the United States that are not compliant with CUSMA, our North American Free Trade Agreement.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said Thursday that dialogue and cooperation with the U.S. are ongoing. She added that it's in Mexico's interest to be excluded from the general tariffs that took effect Wednesday. Outside North America, reactions from world leaders are pouring in. The president of the European Commission early Thursday called the tariffs a major blow to the world economy.
The global economy will massively suffer. Uncertainty will spiral and trigger the rise of further protectionism.
She added the European Union is preparing countermeasures. The UK managed to avoid the heavier tariff rates, only subject to Trump's 10% baseline tariff. Britain will not immediately retaliate with its own duties, seeking first to consult with UK businesses amid a push for a trade deal. But the Prime Minister says all options remain on the table.
We must act in the national interest. A trade war is in nobody's interest, in my view.
Australia and New Zealand also face 10% baseline tariffs. Australia's Prime Minister ruled out imposing its own tariffs in response, but said Trump's decision was not the act of a friend. In nearby New Zealand, the country's trade minister said the rate suggests the Trump administration views trade with New Zealand as relatively balanced. He also said New Zealand would not retaliate. Over in Japan, a top government spokesperson called the 24% tariffs on his country extremely regrettable. South Korea said it would try to negotiate with the U.S. over its 25% rate. Russia was notably left off President Trump's list of sweeping reciprocal tariffs. The White House says existing sanctions over the Ukraine war have already reduced trade with Russia to near zero, making additional tariffs unnecessary. Trump has also proposed secondary tariffs on nations buying Russian oil. The move aims to cut off global support for Moscow's energy sector. Trump said such tariffs would be used if no peace deal is made, and it was Russia's fault. In a symbolic move, the Senate voted to overturn President Trump's proposed tariffs on Canadian goods on Wednesday. 4 Republican senators joined Democrats to pass the resolution. NTD's Daniel Monahan reports on the measure, which came just hours after the president announced sweeping reciprocal tariffs.
The yeas are 51. The nays are 48. The joint resolution's passed.
On Wednesday, Trump called out the 4 Republican senators, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, Mitch McConnell, and Rand Paul, who voted for the resolution. He says the measure faces a dead end, as the House is unlikely to approve it, and he would veto it if it reached his desk. The president urged them to align with the Republican Party and oppose what he called the Democrats' wild and flagrant push to avoid penalizing Canada over fentanyl. Senator Rand Paul, a self-described constitutional conservative, has been critical of Trump's tariff policies, saying they exceed executive authority.
This is a tax, plain and simple. Taxes should not be enacted by one person.
Senator Tim Kaine introduced the bill.
The president's imposition of tariffs against Canada that will be a costly tax increase on American families.
The National Cattlemen's Beef Association applauded Trump's action. It says Australia has sold nearly $30 billion of beef to American consumers, while the U.S. has not been able to sell $1 of beef in Australia due to non-scientific barriers. It also called out the European Union, Brazil, Vietnam, and Thailand for limiting market opportunities and high tariffs on U.S. beef. The National Electrical Contractors Association and the Alliance for American Manufacturing also voiced support, arguing the tariffs prioritize domestic manufacturing and American jobs. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
Bad news for Chinese online retailers like Shein and Temu. Their money-making models are now in peril. President Trump signed an executive order on Wednesday targeting Chinese imports. The measure closes a loophole that previously allowed duty-free shipments under $800. It's called the de minimis rule. Let's dive in.
In February, Trump temporarily paused tariffs on low-cost packages from China and Hong Kong, while the Commerce Department developed stricter enforcement measures. Starting May 2nd, the order imposes a 30% duty, or $25 per item, on what's known as de minimis shipments, citing China's role in synthetic opioid trafficking. That amount rises to $50 per item on June 1st. Carriers must now report shipment details to U.S. Customs and hold international bonds to ensure duty payments. Experts say Chinese e-commerce giants like Shein and Temu have exploited the exemption, gaining an unfair advantage over American retailers.
Coming up, the U.S. reportedly banning diplomats in China from dating Chinese citizens. More on how Beijing could use romantic relationships to extract intelligence. Tennessee lawmakers take a stand against a crime against humanity happening inside China, forced organ harvesting. They have new restrictions for residents seeking China-linked organ transplants. And could cyber attacks from China foreshadow something more serious? Lawmakers probe the Chinese regime's recent spying operations on U.S. officials and how they could lead to something worse. More on that after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The U.S. government has reportedly banned American personnel with security clearance and their close associates from having romantic relationships with Chinese citizens while in China. Former CIA analyst Peter Mattis says China's Ministry of State Security uses human connections to gather U.S. intelligence. And that isn't limited to just spies. They can also call on ordinary Chinese citizens to serve the Chinese Communist Party's interests. Mattis emphasized that anyone dating an American diplomat could become a target and pressured to report intel to the Chinese regime. Reports say the policy has been in effect since January and applies to U.S. personnel in China. This includes the embassy in Beijing and consulates in Guangzhou, Shanghai, Shenyang, Wuhan, and Hong Kong. Some exceptions can be made for relationships established before the policy. But if the request is denied, the relationship must end or the individual must resign. Anyone found violating the policy will be ordered to leave China immediately. Tennessee is taking a stand against a crime against humanity happening in China. The state has enacted a law to stop health insurance coverage for organ transplant surgeries linked to China. The Chinese Communist Party has been harvesting and selling prisoners' organs for at least 2 decades and making huge profit. Here's more.
It makes Tennessee the 4th state to act against the Chinese Communist Party's killing for organ scheme. The law will come into play on January 1st, 2026. Violators face $100,000 in fines for each offense. The law also enacts regulations meant to keep Americans' genetic data safe. Tennessee enacted the bill as state and congressional lawmakers place more attention on forced organ harvesting, a huge problem in China that targets prisoners of conscience. Many of the victims who have their organs forcibly removed were imprisoned for their faith, and many belong to the Falun Dafa spiritual practice. The organs are then sold to patients for transplantation. The hospitals, prisons, and labor camps have made huge profits from this business.
Lawmakers are expressing concern that the Chinese regime's cyber attacks against U.S. telecommunications companies like AT&T and Verizon could lead to even more serious security breaches. On Capitol Hill Wednesday, a House committee examined the potential consequences of failing to stand up to Chinese cyber aggression. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
I think the Chinese Communist Party and their military intelligence apparatus are already in a footing that we would describe as a wartime footing. And they use that language deliberately to deceive us and to make us think, oh, everything's okay, we can just sort of be friends. They do this while hacking us blatantly, while then denying when they get confronted.
Recent cyber attacks from China targeting the U.S. are becoming an increasing threat. The House Oversight's Military and Foreign Affairs Subcommittee probed the impact of the recent Salt Typhoon attacks. Now, this was a Chinese Communist Party operation to spy on calls and text messages of users of AT&T and Verizon. Now, this operation is believed to have targeted President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance while they were on the campaign trail and other U.S. government officials.
They were able to intercept real-time calls and messaging data from over 1 million users. Critically, these attacks focused on gathering intelligence from high-value government and political figures.
And I would say Salt Typhoon is one of the worst breaches our country has ever faced in our telecom infrastructure, and we're still uncovering the full breadth and scope of its attacks.
One panelist says that these attacks occurred because the U.S. requires these companies to have a backdoor into their systems so that law enforcement can access their phone data, but this has allowed U.S. adversaries to access people's calls and texts.
Adding mandated backdoors into the equation essentially, preloads the bugs. We don't even have to find them. We know they're there already.
And these espionage hacks may only be the beginning.
It's as if we were driving on a road hitting a bunch of potholes, and then you ask us to come and talk about the potholes. We don't want to ignore the potholes, but it's scarier when there's gigantic sinkholes ahead of us. And I think we'll look back on Salt Typhoon as perhaps child's play.
Meanwhile, many House Democrats brought up security concerns about the recently leaked Signal chat from members of the Trump administration discussing an attack against terrorists in Yemen.
It is pointless for us to sit in this committee and try to grapple with the real issue of Salt Typhoon and other threats to our communication systems if the people at the top don't take it seriously.
The panel suggests rebuilding cyber infrastructure to make it more secure and changing policies to prevent backdoor access to telecommunications. Reporting by Jack Bradley, NTD News.
China's credit rating is getting a downgrade. Global ratings agency Fitch lowered China's long-term foreign currency credit rating. What does this mean for China? Let's dive in.
And that means the agency views China as less likely to repay its debts in a foreign currency over the long term. A lower credit rating may impact the communist country negatively. China may have to pay higher interest rates when borrowing money from other countries or investors. Also, foreign investors may see China as a riskier place to invest. The rating agency said that China's debt is expected to grow faster than its economy in the coming years. And this is due to U.S. trade tensions as well as weak demand and falling domestic prices. China's currency, the yuan, dropped today to its lowest level in 7 weeks. Fitch said it did not incorporate the latest U.S. reciprocal tariffs into its forecast of China's debt.
On to another new effort from lawmakers, this time in the House. A bipartisan bill aims to counter China's efforts to isolate Taiwan from the international community. Watch.
It's called the Taiwan International Solidarity Act. The bill strengthens existing legislation signed into law during President Trump's first administration in 2020. Beijing often uses a 1971 UN resolution to claim it has sovereignty over Taiwan, despite never having ruled the island. The bill would instruct U.S. representatives in international organizations to resist the Chinese regime's distortion campaign. It would also require the Secretary of State to report to Congress about Beijing's efforts to undermine Taiwan's international relationships and activities. One of the bill's co-sponsors, Republican Congresswoman Young Kim, introduced a second bill last week that would boost America's economic and trade ties with Taiwan.
Now we turn to Southeast Asia. The State Department has approved the sale of 20 F-16 military planes to the Philippines. The deal would be worth an estimated $5.6 billion. The aircraft would boost the country's ability to patrol its territory and improve military cooperation between the U.S. and the Philippines. The announcement came after U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth visited the Philippines last week. He reaffirmed Washington's ironclad commitment to its mutual defense treaty with the country and pledged to strengthen deterrence against threats. That's including Chinese aggression. Beijing claims almost the entire South China Sea as belonging to China, even areas that overlap with the exclusive economic zones of several of its neighbors, including the Philippines. In 2016, an international tribunal ruled China's claims unlawful. A deadline is approaching for TikTok's future in the U.S. The app has until April 5th to find an American buyer, or it could be banned from the U.S. market. In the meantime, potential buyers are reportedly throwing their hats into the ring. Amazon stocks went up about 2% following reports of a possible TikTok bid. Having an in-house social media platform is one of the company's long-standing goals. Here's more on what's happening.
And if the news is true, Amazon isn't the only one who's interested in the purchase. President Trump last month said his team was talking with 4 different groups about the sale of TikTok. Trump did not identify which groups were involved, but since last year, TikTok's fate has been hanging in the balance. Congress demanded that the platform divest from its Chinese parent company, ByteDance. Officials expressed national security concerns over the TikTok ties to the Chinese Communist Party. They say the platform could serve as a Trojan horse to transfer American user data to Beijing. The original deadline was set for January 19th, but President Trump extended it till April 5th.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.